Most people believe betrayal comes from enemies, but almost no one prepares for the damage caused by those who know them best. At some point in life, nearly everyone learns this lesson too late. It usually doesn't happen during conflict. It happens during growth. You start somewhere small. A job, a role, an idea, a direction. Nothing impressive yet, just potential. And during that phase, people around you feel safe. They recognize you. They understand where you stand in the hierarchy. There is no tension. So you open up. You share what you're working on. You explain your plans before they exist. You talk through your doubts, your uncertainties, your next moves. It feels natural, even healthy. These are people you've known for years. Friends, colleagues, sometimes family. They've seen you struggle. They've seen you fail. They've seen you ordinary. And that's exactly why it feels safe. But something subtle begins to shift the moment progress becomes visible. Not success, progress. A new opportunity. A promotion discussion. A side project gaining attention. A change in how others respond to you. Nothing dramatic is said. No arguments. No confrontations. Instead, the tone changes. Advice becomes hesitation. Support becomes caution. Encouragement becomes reminders of risk. You sure this is the right move? Don't get ahead of yourself. Just be careful not to mess things up. At first, it sounds like concern. So you listen. You adjust your pace. You second-guess decisions that once felt clear. You start explaining yourself more, justifying choices, seeking approval that was never required before. And slowly, without realizing it, you hand over something important. Access. They now know what you're trying to build. They know where you're uncertain. They know what you're afraid of losing. And the problem is not that they are evil or malicious. The problem is that closeness removes distance, and distance is what keeps perception clean. When people are close to you, they compare themselves to you. Not consciously, automatically. Your movement becomes a mirror. If you rise, they measure themselves. If you change, they question their own stagnation. If you succeed, something inside them feels exposed. This creates an internal conflict they rarely admit, even to themselves. They want to support you. They also want to remain comfortable in their own position. So they do neither fully. Instead, they influence you quietly. They question timing. They suggest waiting. They highlight worst-case scenarios. They remind you of who you used to be. And because you trust them, you absorb it. You confuse familiarity with loyalty. You confuse shared history with alignment. You confuse emotional closeness with reliability. Boundaries feel unnecessary, even rude. Saying no feels like betrayal. Pulling back feels cold. Keeping things private feels dishonest. So you stay open. And that openness begins to cost you clarity. You feel guilt when you move ahead alone. You feel pressure to explain progress. You feel obligated to slow down so others can keep up emotionally. And without anyone actively attacking you, momentum fades. Not because you were wrong. Not because the plan was flawed. But because too many people had access to something that required distance to survive. This is how most people lose ground. Not through opposition. Through familiarity. Not through enemies. Through those who never meant to hurt them, but couldn't handle watching them grow. Ethan had always been the reliable one. Not the loudest in the room. Not the most aggressive. But the person everyone trusted to keep things steady. He worked in a mid-sized tech company, joined straight out of college, and slowly became someone others leaned on. When projects went wrong, he stayed late. When deadlines slipped, he filled the gaps. When managers needed someone dependable, his name came up. Over time, that reputation turned into something else. People talked to him. They shared frustrations. They vented about leadership, about stagnation, about feeling overlooked. Ethan listened. He always did. And eventually, he started to see something they didn't. The company was drifting. Decisions were slow. Products were safe but uninspired. Meanwhile, the market was moving fast. New players were appearing. Smaller teams were doing more with less. So Ethan began working on an idea after hours. Nothing flashy, just a tool that solved the problem he saw every day. Inefficient internal workflows that cost time and money. He didn't announce it. At first, it was just curiosity. Then it became serious. And that's when he did what felt natural. He told his friends at work, people he ate lunch with, people he had defended in meetings, people who had complained to him for years about how stuck things felt. They reacted with interest, at least on the surface. "That's smart," one said. "You've always been good at that stuff," another added. "Let me know if you need help," a third offered. Encouraged, Ethan shared more. He explained how it worked, what problem it solved, how it could be pitched internally, or even spun into something bigger one day. He wasn't asking for permission. He was sharing excitement. But over the following weeks, something changed. One friend started questioning the idea's timing. Maybe wait until the next quarter. Things are unstable right now. Another began pointing out risks. Management hates surprises. You don't want to make them uncomfortable. Someone else joked, lightly, about Ethan getting ambitious. None of it sounded hostile. It sounded reasonable. So Ethan slowed down. He refined instead of testing. He polished instead of presenting. He waited for the right moment. Then, during a strategy meeting months later, something strange happened. A senior manager introduced a new initiative. It wasn't Ethan's tool exactly, but it was close enough to hurt. Same problem. Similar approach. Different voice. The room reacted with interest, questions, energy. Ethan sat quietly, trying to make sense of it. After the meeting, one of his friends pulled him aside. Honestly, they said, it's probably better this way. Less pressure on you. Another told him, you can always contribute later. No one mentioned the idea he had shared. No one acknowledged the overlap. Weeks passed. The initiative moved forward. Ethan wasn't included. When performance reviews came around, feedback shifted. He was still dependable, still solid, but not strategic, not forward-looking. The word surprised him. He had been thinking strategically for months, but the perception had changed, quietly, without confrontation. Later, over drinks, one friend admitted something without realizing its weight. People were starting to see you differently, they said. It made things awkward. That was the moment Ethan understood. Not that someone had stolen from him. Not that there had been a conspiracy. But that the people closest to him had seen his growth before the system did, and it made them uncomfortable. They hadn't attacked him. They hadn't supported him either. They had redirected the energy away from him, subtly, safely, without risk. And because Ethan had trusted them with early access, he had given away the advantage of distance. By the time he realized what had happened, nothing dramatic had gone wrong, which made it harder to explain, harder to point to a single mistake. But something was lost. Momentum, position, the version of himself that had been moving forward without asking for permission. Not because he faced an enemy, but because he gave too much access to people who were never prepared to watch him change. Ethan's story feels personal, but it isn't unique. What makes it unsettling is not the outcome, but how familiar the process is. Nothing explosive happened. No argument, no betrayal scene, no clear villain. Just a slow shift in perception and position. And this pattern shows up everywhere. It appears whenever someone begins to move out of the role others assign to them. The moment growth creates imbalance, relationships adjust themselves, often without words. History is full of these quiet moments. Rulers who trusted lifelong companions more than capable rivals. Leaders who promoted friends out of loyalty and slowly lost control of their court. Innovators who shared unfinished ideas with peers, only to watch the momentum drift elsewhere. The surface details change. The structure doesn't. Closeness creates familiarity. Familiarity creates comparison. Comparison creates discomfort. And discomfort seeks resolution. Sometimes that resolution looks like opposition, but more often it looks like guidance, concern, or restraint. Slow down. Be realistic. Don't rock the boat. These phrases have ended more upward trajectories than open conflict ever did. Because when resistance comes from an enemy, it sharpens focus. When it comes from a friend, it blurs judgment. People expect rivals to compete. They prepare for that. They don't prepare for hesitation disguised as care. And the closer someone is, the more weight their reaction carries. Their doubts sound wiser. Their caution sounds earned. Their discomfort feels like a signal you should listen to. Over time, this creates a strange dynamic. Those closest to you often become the first audience to your potential before the world has reacted. And early audiences are dangerous. They see possibility before proof, movement before validation. Without external confirmation, growth looks like disruption. To them, you are changing faster than the shared narrative allows. So they stabilize the situation the only way they know how, by pulling you back toward the version of you they understand. Not out of cruelty, out of self-preservation. Because your rise quietly forces a question they didn't ask for. What does this say about me? That question doesn't need an answer to influence behavior. It shows up in tone, in timing, in enthusiasm that fades just enough to matter. This is why so many people look back and say the same thing years later with clarity they didn't have in the moment. I should have kept that to myself. I shared it too early. I listened when I should have moved. Not because sharing is wrong, but because proximity changes incentives. Distance allows people to evaluate outcomes. Closeness forces them to evaluate themselves. And when growth creates tension, most people don't confront it directly. They diffuse it, quietly, gradually, in ways that feel reasonable while they're happening. Which is why this pattern repeats. In offices, in friendships, in families, in leadership circles, and why it rarely feels like a lesson while you're inside it. Only afterward does it become clear that what slowed you down wasn't resistance. It was access. There is an old idea about power that feels uncomfortable when you first hear it. It suggests that trust is not a moral decision. It is a strategic one. Not because people are unkind by nature, but because relationships change once incentives shift. The principle is simple when stripped of drama. People who are close to you have emotional stakes in who you remain. People who oppose you have clearer incentives and fewer illusions. In Ethan's case, his mistake wasn't ambition. It wasn't poor timing. It wasn't lack of skill. It was assuming that shared history guaranteed alignment. Those around him weren't competing with him openly. They didn't need to. Their influence came from familiarity, from the right to question him, from being heard without resistance. An opponent doesn't get that access. When someone stands opposite you, their position is visible. Their interest is defined. Their behavior is easier to read. You may not like it, but you understand it. With friends, the lines blur. They don't need to undermine you directly. They only need to shape your perception of risk. They don't block your path. They convince you to pause. This is why throughout history, capable leaders often relied on former rivals rather than lifelong companions. Not because rivals were loyal, but because their motivations were legible. A rival who benefits from your success will support you clearly. A friend who feels displaced by your success will hesitate silently. The idea isn't to replace friendship with suspicion. It's to recognize that trust based on emotion creates blind spots. When access is unlimited, influence becomes invisible. Ethan gave away his thinking before it was strong enough to stand alone. He invited reactions before results existed. He allowed proximity to shape momentum. By the time authority noticed his ideas, they no longer felt like his. Not because someone stole them, but because too many people had touched them before they were ready to be seen. This principle appears harsh until you understand what it's really pointing at. Power doesn't respond to intention. It responds to perception. And perception is fragile when too many familiar voices are involved. Opposition sharpens behavior. Closeness softens it. Not always. Not instantly. But often enough to matter. This is why people who rise quickly tend to grow quieter as they move upward. They share less. They explain less. They allow outcomes to speak before opinions enter the room. Not because they trust no one, but because they understand that access is a form of leverage, and leverage, once given freely, is rarely returned. Ethan didn't lose because someone worked against him. He lost because he never realized that influence doesn't require hostility. It only requires proximity. What happened to Ethan wasn't driven by a single emotion. It was driven by several, interacting quietly beneath the surface. The first was fear. Not fear of failure, fear of displacement. The people around Ethan weren't afraid that he would fail. They were afraid that he would succeed without them. His movement introduced uncertainty into a stable social order. Roles that had been clear for years suddenly felt negotiable. When someone close to you changes direction, it threatens predictability. And predictability is comforting. Even when people complain about stagnation, they often depend on it emotionally. So fear didn't show up as resistance. It showed up as concern. The second force was ego. Ego doesn't always demand superiority. Sometimes it only demands consistency. Ethan had always been the reliable one, the supporter, the listener, the person behind the scenes. His shift toward initiative disrupted that identity. When someone breaks from the role others have assigned them, it creates a quiet tension. If he can do this, why haven't I? That question is uncomfortable. Most people don't confront it directly. They deflect it. They minimize the change. They frame it as risky. They subtly pull the person back into their familiar role. Not consciously, automatically. The third element was status. Status isn't just formal rank. It's relational positioning. Ethan's growth altered the internal hierarchy of his social circle before it altered the company's hierarchy. That meant his friends experienced the status shift without the benefits that would have justified it. No promotion title. No official recognition. Just the feeling that something was changing. Unrecognized status shifts are the most destabilizing. They create imbalance without explanation. So people respond by restoring equilibrium. They question legitimacy. They slow momentum. They reframe ambition as impatience. The fourth factor was expectation. Because Ethan was close, people felt entitled to his process. They expected access to his thinking. They expected inclusion. They expected to be consulted. When he shared, it reinforced that expectation. When he hesitated later, it felt like withdrawal. So he kept sharing, even when it weakened his position. This is one of the quiet traps of closeness. The more you give early, the harder it becomes to pull back later without friction. Finally, there was perception. Once people began to see Ethan as someone who might be getting ahead of himself, every action passed through that filter. Caution became wisdom. Delay became maturity. Restraint became responsibility. The same behavior that would have been praised in someone else was reframed as overreach in him. And perception, once formed, resists correction. What makes this dynamic dangerous is that none of it requires bad intentions. Everyone involved can believe they are being reasonable, supportive, even helpful. But human psychology doesn't operate on fairness. It operates on equilibrium. When growth threatens equilibrium, influence quietly moves to restore it. Ethan didn't misjudge intelligence. He misjudged incentives. He assumed emotional closeness meant shared outcomes. In reality, closeness often amplifies unspoken conflicts, especially when one person begins to move faster than the group. This is why boundaries aren't about distrust. They're about preserving clarity in environments where emotion clouds perception. And why understanding human behavior requires looking past what people say and watching what situations quietly encourage them to do. Several months later, Ethan's story could have been rewritten in a very different way. Across town, in a different company, a woman named Maya was facing a similar situation. She had been part of a small marketing team for years, trusted by everyone, relied upon for ideas and insight. She, too, was on the cusp of introducing a project that could change the company's workflow, an internal tool for campaign analytics that would save hundreds of hours. But Maya approached the problem differently. Instead of sharing the project with close colleagues before it was ready, she worked quietly. She documented results meticulously, tested her assumptions, and prepared a small, controlled presentation for leadership. Her friends at work had no early access. She didn't invite opinions before she had outcomes. She didn't ask for feedback from the people who might feel threatened by her initiative. She kept the momentum private. When she finally presented the project, the reaction was striking. Leadership was intrigued. Her colleagues were impressed, some even surprised, because the idea had materialized fully formed, not as a work in progress that invited judgment or hesitation. And yet, she didn't alienate anyone. The friends who might have been envious were included only at the right time, after results existed. They could support or contribute without feeling destabilized by early insight or unfinished potential. Their role was defined by achievement, not speculation. The contrast between Maya and Ethan is subtle but crucial. Ethan's mistake was trust before proof. Maya's success was timing. She understood that influence and perception are affected not just by the idea itself, but by who sees it, when, and how it manifests. The principle of measured access operates quietly. It is not about withholding information to manipulate. It is about preserving clarity for yourself and for those around you. Early exposure creates influence for others, not for you. Controlled exposure preserves your leverage. Maya's approach didn't feel strategic to anyone but her. There was no overt calculation, no plotting. She simply allowed her work to exist independently until it could stand on its own. When the idea was revealed, everyone could see it clearly, its merit, its impact, and her role in creating it. No distortions, no misinterpretations, no subtle erosion of momentum. This is the law in action. Influence is strongest when proximity doesn't preempt outcome. Success, when shared too early with those whose perception is vulnerable to comparison or insecurity, can become diluted. Success, when revealed after substance is proven, becomes undeniable. And this is why some people seem to move forward without resistance while others stall in silence. Maya's story reinforces the same principle Ethan encountered, but with an outcome that illustrates the power of restraint, timing, and understanding human psychology. Looking at both Ethan and Maya, patterns start to emerge that are deeper than individual decisions or personalities. It's not about who is good or bad. It's about human nature and the way influence interacts with proximity, perception, and access. Ethan's growth was visible too early. He shared too much. His friends, who once provided comfort and advice, became unwitting moderators of his progress. Their reactions weren't malicious. They were natural responses to the tension his advancement created in their own perception of the world. Maya, by contrast, allowed her work to mature out of immediate view. She gave no one the opportunity to preempt the momentum. When the project finally emerged, there was clarity, respect, and alignment. No one had the emotional leverage to slow her down because the work existed independently of anyone else's opinion until the right moment. The principle that unites both stories is deceptively simple. Access is influence. Those closest to you often wield the most subtle power, not through confrontation, but through the soft shaping of decisions and perceptions. They can either accelerate or slow your movement without ever appearing to interfere. Distance preserves clarity. Proximity creates entanglement. It is why people in positions of influence often rely on former rivals rather than friends for honest feedback. A rival's interests are clear. Their alignment is conditional but predictable. A friend's alignment is invisible until it's too late to adjust. Human behavior, at its core, is reactive. People respond to what they perceive, not to what you intend. They measure themselves against you, consciously or unconsciously. Growth changes the relational equilibrium, and equilibrium seeks restoration. When momentum is visible too soon, it triggers hesitation, and hesitation is powerful. It slows progress, it dilutes initiative, and it quietly erodes what could have been achieved with clarity and timing. By examining these two cases side by side, we see that influence is not just about skills, intelligence, or talent. It's about the invisible dynamics of trust, access, and perception. The lesson is subtle. Manage the flow of information and the timing of exposure. Not to deceive, not to manipulate, but to preserve clarity for yourself and for the work itself. And when you understand this, the stories make sense. The setbacks, the invisible resistance, the quiet delays, all become part of a pattern that anyone observing human nature would recognize. It's the law of measured access and action, reflected not in overt betrayal, but in the silent influence of those closest to you. The pattern repeats across careers, relationships, and leadership roles. Recognizing it is the first step toward navigating it without unnecessary loss. The stories of Ethan and Maya are not about morality. They are about observation, about understanding how people actually behave, rather than how we wish they would. Growth changes relationships. Proximity amplifies influence. Trust without boundaries can quietly slow or distort progress. And the most subtle forms of control are often wielded by those we consider closest, not enemies we expect to oppose us. It is a quiet, almost invisible force. The way familiarity reshapes perception, the way early access dilutes leverage, the way human nature seeks balance before truth can fully assert itself. The insight is simple, even if it feels uncomfortable. Your success will be interpreted, filtered, and sometimes reshaped by those who know you best. The timing of exposure, who sees your progress and when, often matters more than the brilliance of the idea itself. There is no blame here, no villain, no dramatic betrayal, only patterns. Patterns that repeat in offices, friendships, families, and leadership circles. Patterns that reveal the delicate mechanics of human interaction, influence, and perception. And when you observe these patterns carefully, the lesson is not to mistrust others, but to preserve clarity. To understand the subtle dynamics that exist whenever trust and proximity intersect with ambition and growth. The quiet truth is that human behavior is neither kind nor cruel. It simply is. And those who understand it can navigate the world with awareness, timing, and a sense of perspective that most never develop. Sometimes the most powerful action is restraint. Sometimes the most important influence is patience. And sometimes the simplest observation, noticing how people respond when you move, is more valuable than any advice or strategy. In the end, the world operates on perception as much as reality. Recognizing this allows you to see the unseen, move with discretion, and understand the patterns that shape both progress and resistance. And that quiet understanding, calm, deliberate, unshakable, is where real insight begins.